Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to be unpacking the theories, the structures, and the really intense internal debates of the radical left in Germany. We're acting purely as neutral observers here, basically taking a magnifying glass to their political theory, movement debates, and even state security assessments just to understand exactly how these groups think and operate. Let's dive right in.
So think about this for a second. Can a society actually be completely free of authority? Or is modern democracy just a massive illusion? That provocative question sits right at the very heart of the movements we're examining today, and it really sets the intellectual stakes for everything we're about to cover. Like, are modern parliaments truly representative, or do they just mask these deeper systems of control? That fundamental, deep-seated skepticism is the engine driving the entire ideology of the radical left.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. We're covering 1. Democracy in the crosshairs of the left. 2. From autonomous to post-autonomous. 3. Anti-fascism, ideology or systemic question. 4. The Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the state's view. And finally, 5. Utopias, councils, and the multitude.
Section 1, Democracy and the Crosshairs of the Left. To truly understand these movements, we first have to understand exactly why they fundamentally oppose the modern state. According to the highly influential theorist Johannes Agnoli, whose work heavily influenced the extra-parliamentary opposition in Germany, the bourgeois state is essentially a state of capital. So the argument here is that liberal democracy promises this formal equality on paper, but in reality, it actually just masks the rule of the capital's class. Basically, the state's primary economic function, in this view, is maintaining corporate profit margins, which means to them, true emancipation is literally impossible without completely changing property relations. This historical clash between Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin perfectly illustrates a split in radical left theory that still totally matters today. Like, how do you actually overthrow the system? Marx advocated for the working class to form a political party and literally conquer state power. But Bakunin, he completely disagreed. He argued that you absolutely cannot build a free society using authoritarian structures, like a centralized state or a rigid political party. So you have this huge question. Do you take over the state apparatus to change it, or do you dismantle it entirely so you don't create new authoritarianism? And for the groups we're looking at, this quote from Agnelli really captures their absolute baseline. He says, "The voter is a mere instrument for distributing power among parties. Every election, regardless of the outcome, stabilizes the existing political social order." So the crucial takeaway here is that they don't see parliament as representing the people at all. It is viewed as an illusion, a mechanism that crushes fundamental opposition and just legitimizes capitalist rule, no matter who actually wins the election. Moving right along to Section 2, From Autonomous to Post-Autonomous. Let's see how these anti-authoritarian theories translate into actual physical organizations over time. Tracing the history of a group called Avanti shows us a really clear evolutionary path. They were founded back in 1989 from these isolated, autonomous groups in North Germany. But over time, they started to coordinate. By 2007, they were playing a massive central role in the G8 Heiligendamm blockades. The Bremen group Solid.org joins them in 2008, and finally in 2014, they formally dissolve into a much larger network called the Interventionistische Linke, or the IL. This timeline shows a distinct, massive shift from isolated groups toward a desire to build a nationally capable, networked radical left. This transition from autonomous to post-autonomous is a huge strategic pivot. The traditional autonomy focused heavily on individual self-realization, completely rejected fixed structures, and used very decentralized, sometimes clandestine action. But the post-autonomy movement, like the IL model, moves toward binding structures. They're looking for broader societal alliances and long-term transformation strategies. It's a shift toward combining radical critique with surprisingly pragmatic, cross-spectrum alliance building. But despite this shift toward more organized alliance building, we really shouldn't misunderstand their end goal. As the IL's own materials explicitly state, their aim remains a revolutionary break with national and global capitalism, with the power of the bourgeois state and all forms of oppression. So they might be using more cooperative tactics today, but their ultimate destination is still the total revolutionary overthrow of the current capitalist system. Section 3. Anti-fascism, ideology or systemic question. Now, what's really interesting here is how the sources reveal deep strategic divisions within the left regarding how to actually fight right-wing extremism today. There is a really fascinating debate happening here. On one side, the IAL focuses heavily on building a firewall against the AfD's ideology and youth organizations. But then an article in Enquête Analyse et Critique sharply criticizes that approach. They argue that fascism isn't just an independent ideology. It's actually a product of neoliberal capitalism and state militarization. Meaning, from their perspective, true anti-fascism must target the underlying capitalist and bourgeois conditions that allow right-wing movements to thrive in the first place.
To back this up, critics point to this historical 1932 quote from Ernst Thälmann of the KPD, who warns that the anti-fascistische Aktion was too focused on demonstrations and too little oriented towards strategic work in the factories and unemployment offices. The author uses this to argue against modern anti-fascists just chasing viral movement moments or endless street protests. Instead, they're advocating for the much more unglamorous, everyday work of organizing in neighborhoods and workplaces to build real, sustainable counterpower. From this systemic perspective, the radical left views fascism as a form of bourgeois rule that gets utilized when capitalism faces a crisis. They argue that mainstream parties are actually normalizing authoritarian and nationalist measures, and that state militarization, like increased police actions or the Heimschutz division, is laying the groundwork for systemic authoritarianism. Essentially, they're arguing that the state itself is driving a process of fascization, making the state part of the problem rather than the solution. Section 4. Office for the Protection of the Constitution, the state's view. Having explored the internal ideology, we absolutely have to impartially turn the lens around and see how the state security apparatus categorizes these same movements. State authorities, like the Verfassungsschutz in Baden-Württemberg, monitor these groups very closely. And they don't just view them as political critics, they categorize them strictly under the umbrella of left-wing extremism and militancy, monitoring them as a potential threat to the democratic order. According to the State Threat Assessment, the Autonomen are viewed as the primary violence-oriented faction in left-wing extremism. Because they view the state as fundamentally authoritarian, they completely reject it, often attempting to create self-determined free spaces beyond state control. The intelligence reports state that violence is considered their central tool for political dispute, with a very low inhibition threshold. Their primary targets? State representatives, like the police, and political opponents. Furthermore, the state has a very specific read on the interventionistische Linke. They assess that the IL maintains a merely tactical relationship with violence, while integrating autonomous groups into broader, non-extremist alliances. Essentially, intelligence agencies view groups like the IL as a strategic bridge, intentionally bringing militant autonomous tactics into otherwise peaceful civil society protests. Which brings us to Section 5, Utopias, Councils, and the Multitude. If the current parliamentary state is to be dismantled, what exactly do these groups propose to build in its place? The historical alternative to parliament is council democracy, or rated democracy. Think of it like this. In a parliamentary democracy, representatives have a free mandate and there are fixed election cycles. But in a council democracy, delegates have an imperative mandate, meaning they are strictly tied to the basis instructions. Plus, there's no separation of powers, legislative and executive functions are totally merged into one unified body, and delegates are subject to permanent recallability. They can literally be fired at any moment. Now, modern post-autonomous groups often look to theorists like Hart and Negri, who talk about the multitude. This multitude is composed of the precarious, the indebted, and the unrepresented. They completely reject traditional political representation and media monopolies. Instead, they demand that public resources, like water, for example, be managed as the common, directly by citizens, not the state. The whole focus is on decentralized, network-based cooperation outside of any state control. This quote from Hart and Negri really brilliantly illustrates their utopian vision. They say the assemblies of the multitude create a majority that is no homogeneous group and no solid block, but a concert of differences. It's this vision of a post-state federalism where open assemblies organically harmonize differences without any central authority, completely bypassing the traditional liberal protections for minorities in favor of consensus. But that leaves us with a critical tension to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. Does true emancipation really require the end of the state, or do these radical, decentralized utopias risk breeding entirely new forms of unchecked authoritarianism? Removing established checks and balances is a delicate and perhaps dangerous balance. It's a fascinating debate, and I really hope this breakdown helps you understand the ideology at the very core of these movements.